yes, you may have some friends that won't understand and they're offended and they feel like you've joined the enemy. But in the end, do you really want others making your decision for you? Or do you want to make your own decisions?
The Ready Life, into the country.
Hi, I'm Nick Meisner, and I want to welcome you back to the Ready Life podcast. This is our 4th of July edition, which is a little different than our other episodes. Lisa wanted to be here for this, but she got tied up on a project and was unable to make it in time for recording. But we very much agree on what I'm about to say in this episode. And I think that this is probably one of the most important episodes of the whole year. You know, on this 4th of July, I'm declaring my independence from allowing the media to put me into someone else's box. It happens all the time. There's 2 camps presented, neither of which are really good, and you're supposed to choose which of those camps you belong to. And once you belong to that camp, you're obligated to support it and the positions that your camp advocates. And if you dare to step out of line and depart from the talking points of your camp, you're viewed with suspicion and possibly even disowned. You didn't stay in your box. And I think this creates a really unhealthy environment where we publicly accept things that we privately are troubled by. And we do this out of fear. Fear of being marginalized, fear that we're going to lose favor with the other friends in our camp, folks that we mostly agree with and that we want to hang out with. And that fear is real. I see it all the time, and I've felt that pressure too. So I'm here publicly declaring my independence from other people's boxes. I have my own unique position on issues, and that's the only box that I want to be in. I want to be eclectic. I don't know what the connotations of that word are now, but I just know the dictionary definition, and I just want to judge each position I hold based upon its own merits, rather than based upon who else agrees with it or what camp it comes from. I just want to do the right thing. Because I'm one person, I'm not a democracy where I have to go with whatever the majority wants. And speaking of that word democracy, it kind of segues into one of these boxes that we have created and that I want to break down in this episode. Democracy is a word that you hear all the time on the news from politicians. Democracy, democracy, democracy. That word really gets under my skin because this country was not established as a democracy. Far from it. Democracy, that word democracy, it comes from the word demos, or people, and kratos, or rule. So rule by the people. And in a direct democracy, the entire populace votes on everything, and anything that gets 51% or more passes. The majority rules. Sounds good, right? But the dark side of a democracy is that it's also known as mob rule. What happens if you are among the 49%? If the 51% majority decide that all people with red hair should be incarcerated, that's what happens. There are no protections for the 49%. There's no law other than the fickle will of the 51%. Because of all of this, our founders were generally very against the idea of making America into a democracy. They wanted to build absolute rights into our system of government so that the will of the people would rule, but there would be limits to this rule that guaranteed protections for the rights of the 49%, the folks that were not in the majority. They did this using what we call laws. You've heard the term, the rule of law, and this is why it's so important. You know, we often think of laws in very negative terms, since lately our government has taken to passing massive numbers of huge laws, and it's become a crippling burden. But it's helpful to remember that without laws, you are one election away from having your property stripped away and being burned at the stake, which, by the way, has happened literally many times in Earth's history. So the rule of law is really that important, and that's what we get in a constitutional republic. And this is why I shake my head whenever someone talks about America being a democracy. We are not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. You've probably heard that famous quote of Benjamin Franklin when he was leaving Constitution Hall and someone asked him what form of government that they'd drawn up for us. And his immortal words were, "A republic, if you can keep it." So we are a constitutional republic, not a democracy. And you'll see why this is so important in just a minute. Now, let's step to the present, as in, let's say, just the past few weeks. We've seen states doing things that a democracy might do. For instance, on June 19, Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry signed House Bill number 71 into law, which requires all public, elementary, secondary, and post-secondary schools to display a specific version of the Ten Commandments on the wall of every classroom, along with a few other historical documents. While the language of the bill is carefully worded to treat the Ten Commandments as a historical document rather than a religious one, this was clearly a smokescreen to protect the bill from the inevitable legal challenges that are coming. The governor, when signing this bill into law, he made no bones about the fact that this was all about the Ten Commandments. And interestingly, Governor Landry, who's a lifelong Catholic, hosted the public signing of this law at Our Lady of Fatima Catholic School in Lafayette. It's an interesting choice for signing a bill that is only historical in nature, don't you think?
This is one of the bills that got the press over here. This bill mandates the display of the Ten Commandments in every classroom in public, elementary, secondary, and post-education schools in the state of Louisiana. Amen.
In a democracy, doing something like this, with this law in Louisiana, doing something like that is legal if the majority agree. The majority of folks in Louisiana are Christian. I've looked up the stats, and even though Catholics have a different version of the Ten Commandments than what is required in this law, they've formed a coalition with the Protestants, which made them combined a majority. And in a democracy, the majority rules. Sure, there will always be other religions, but those religions are the 49%. So they don't count, and it doesn't matter how this affects them. That's a democracy at work, right before your eyes. And right up the road from Louisiana, just last week, the Oklahoma State Department of Education issued an order that, and I'm going to quote here, "Effective immediately, all Oklahoma schools are required to incorporate the Bible, which includes the Ten Commandments, as an instructional support into the curriculum." Later on it says, "Adherence to this mandate is compulsory." And then a little bit later, "Immediate and strict compliance is expected."
We will be issuing a memo today that every school district will adhere to, which is that every teacher, every classroom in the state will have a Bible in the classroom and will be teaching from the Bible in the classroom.
So the state superintendent confirmed in an interview that, get this, any teacher who willingly and knowingly does not comply, there will be repercussions for them, even potentially losing their teaching license. Once again, in a democracy, this sort of thing is permissible as long as the majority, the 51% or more, approve. And in Oklahoma, at least 2/3 of them say that they are Christians. So the majority rules, and the other religions out there will just have to deal with it. Once again, a democracy at work. Now, question, what happens if the makeup of an area changes and, let's say Islam becomes the majority religion? What if the majority say that they want the Quran to be taught in our public schools because it has historical value? You see where this is going, right? This is what a democracy is. And if you're wondering what form of government that America has, this ain't it. What about in a constitutional republic? This is what America was formed to be. How's that supposed to work? Well, in a constitutional republic, the will of the majority still rules, but there are limitations. Government is limited. This is key, friends. Government is limited. Those limitations are called rights. If the majority wants to make everyone pay a higher sales tax rate, then they can do that by having their elected representatives pass a law to that effect. That's within the government's limited jurisdiction. But if, on the other hand, the majority wants to arrest anyone who criticizes them, they can't do that because there are fundamental, unalienable rights that limit the government and that protect its citizens from being restricted. So even though the majority has 51% or even 99%, they are blocked from infringing upon the rights of the 1%, because there are certain things that no one should ever be forced to do or forced not to do. These are the unalienable rights that we always possess and which our Constitution recognizes. And that's what makes a constitutional republic different. That's what makes America different. At least it used to. But regardless of what's going on right now, we've got to keep our eye on what should be done and don't settle for less than that. Now, I want to be clear about something. Lisa and I are devout Christians. We're huge supporters of the Ten Commandments. Not that God's law needs our support, but it's extremely important to us, is what I'm getting at. We believe in the Ten Commandments so much that we actually keep all 10 of them as they're written, even the one that almost no one does, the fourth commandment about the Sabbath, the seventh day, keeping it holy. That's how passionate we are about the Ten Commandments. So what we're saying here in no wise is intended to diminish the Ten Commandments or to say that they should not be practiced. What we're talking about here is whether the government has the right to force secular institutions to promote the religion of the majority. That's what we're talking about. Just for instance, if the government is going to be forcing its secular institutions to promote the Ten Commandments, who's going to decide which version of those commandments is promoted? Like I mentioned earlier, you realize that the Catholics hold to a different version of the Ten Commandments than the one that's required in the Louisiana law. The Catholics' version omits the second commandment about graven images, and then it splits the 10th commandment about coveting into two parts, making up the 9th and 10th commandment. The Jewish 10 commandments are also a little bit different. So who decides which is the right one? And who decided to truncate portions of the 2nd and 4th commandments in this Louisiana law? Those are the commandments about graven images and the Sabbath. They were truncated. They were shortened. And who decided what portion of these commandments to keep and what to discard? Obviously, the legislature decided these theological questions. In Oklahoma, who's going to decide which version of the Bible to use? Is it going to be the King James Version or the NIV or the NSRV Catholic edition Or what about the inclusive Bible? And yes, that's a thing. And it is what the title sounds like. So who gets to decide this stuff? Another question. Do you really want politicians, the profession that is most notorious for lying and unethical behavior, to be the arbiters of our theological questions, deciding what the government will require us to do at the end of a barrel? Does that sound like a good idea or a good precedent to set? And for that matter, do you really want anyone forcing their position on you regarding religious matters? I know, I get it. This seems like something so harmless that it isn't going to hurt anyone, right? I love the Bible and the Ten Commandments. It's God's word, so how could this be bad? Well, if you aren't a mainline Christian, this is bad even right now. But even if you are, it's the precedent that is the really dangerous thing at this point. Because if the state can force teachers to teach our children to learn the Christian 10 Commandments and the Bible in our public institutions, then the state has the right to force our children to study the Apocrypha, which might sound great for Catholics, but that would be opposed by Protestants. Or the state has the right to force our children to study the Quran. Or what about this? If the state can pick and choose which of the 10 Commandments to include and which portions to omit, is it a far stretch for the state to outlaw the taking of God's name in vain or to force us to rest on the Sabbath day? And if we're talking about that, who gets to decide which day is the Sabbath? There's a lot of debate about that. Are these questions that we really want another human to decide for us, especially a body of corrupt politicians who can then force us at the point of a gun? Is that what you want? Remember, friends, precedents are usually set by things that look harmless, not by big, scary things. Okay, so we've looked at just a tiny bit of the legal issues with the laws like this. But I'll be honest, my biggest issue actually comes from the scriptures itself. You know, we're talking about lawyers arguing about the 10 Commandments, but Jesus also had a lawyer ask him about the 10 Commandments. He asked him which one was the greatest commandment. And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then he said something really interesting. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So there's 10 laws, but 2 underlying principles. Interestingly, God's law was written on 2 tables of stone. That's in Exodus 31:18. So this totally makes sense with the way that Jesus distilled it down to 2 principles. The first great commandment is our duty to God, and that's the first 4 commandments. No other gods, no graven images, don't take God's name in vain, and the Sabbath. And then the second great commandment is our duty to our fellow men, loving your neighbor as yourself. That's the last 6 commandments: honoring parents, murder, adultery, stealing, bearing false witness against our neighbor, and coveting. 10 laws, 2 principles. So tuck this away for just a moment. Now we turn to the definitive chapter in the Bible on civil government, and that's Romans 13. You remember this chapter, right? Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, or some versions say the governing authorities. And it continues on to define the duties of the civil government. It says things like, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil, and so on. Now, I read a fascinating verse that I want to share with you from this chapter, and it's verse 9. It says, this is from the chapter in the Bible on how Christians relate to the civil government. Here's what it says. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, friends, Paul was an expert in the law. He'd been a Pharisee of the Pharisees. The law was his thing, and he knew it forward and backward, but something doesn't sound right here in this verse. Did you notice that something seems off, like something's missing? That's right. You don't see a single one of the first 4 commandments in this list. You only see commandments from the second table about our duty to our fellow men. Why is the first table of the law missing entirely? Why is it only, you shall love your neighbor as yourself? Why is that the only thing that he's talking about here? Well, you see, Paul is making it super clear that these governing authorities only have jurisdiction over matters between people, the things that can be summed up as, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is the role of the government. But the civil government has 0 jurisdiction over the first table of the law, those things that are between us and God. You know, the no other gods, no graven images, don't take God's name in vain, and the Sabbath. That is outside the jurisdiction of the government, which is why Paul entirely omitted the first 4 commandments when discussing the civil government. And you know what? Paul didn't come up with this principle. This actually came from Jesus when in Matthew 22:21 he said, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So there are certain things that the government has jurisdiction over, matters that are between people, like killing, stealing, things like this, keeping the peace. Those are Caesar's things, and it's his duty to keep the peace. But our duty to God is separate and distinct, and Caesar has 0 jurisdiction over those matters. Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And this, friends, is why the civil government has no business getting involved in religious matters, even ones that I approve of and support, like the 10 Commandments. I don't want the government doing what it always does, corrupting things. And the last thing we need is the government trying to help out God's work. That is not its role. The government needs to keep its hands off anything between us and God. This is one of the most fundamental rights that we've gained in this great experiment of ours called America. And if you'd like to get a little more history on the first man in America to recognize this principle and to put it into practice, you can visit our 4th of July episode from last year by going to thereadylife.com/7. That's the number 7, because that was episode number 7. And we discuss a remarkable man named Roger Williams. Now, when we started out this episode, we were talking about being put into boxes, and nothing could be truer than with this issue. If you're a liberal or consider yourself on the left, the media would have you believe that the state should almost be waging war on religion, that it's freedom from religion rather than freedom of religion. If you consider yourself more in the conservative or right box, then the folks in that box would have you believe that America was founded as a Christian nation. Our founders were devout evangelicals who wanted the state to support the church as long as it didn't create a state-funded religion, and so on and so forth. If you find yourself in this camp, you see the war on Christianity that is being waged, and you probably agree that requiring the 10 Commandments and the Bible in the public schools seems like a much better alternative to the agenda of the left if you had to choose one or the other. But I would encourage you to break out of your box. Don't confine yourself to one of these 2 boxes. Judge each position that you take based upon its own merits. Do that with this issue. Yes, you may have some friends that won't understand, and they're offended and they feel like you've joined the enemy. But in the end, do you really want others making your decision for you? Or do you want to make your own decisions? The tyranny of the majority is a real thing, friends. So don't let the media put you into one of their two boxes. Stay out of the boxes and just stand for the right thing. Declare your independence from being forced into someone else's box. And we wish you many blessings on this, one of the greatest of all holidays. We'll be back next week with our usual fare. We'll see you then.